Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. My name is Alice, and I'm pleased to be here, and I'm pleased that you're all here. And as you can see, we have a group of presenters with us today. My role is just to kick things off and then tell you a little bit about logistics, and I will be back later on to help host the Q&A mode. So on the questions, that's part of the logistics I want to make you aware of. There's a little question area. As you think of your questions, go ahead and enter them. We may answer some along the way, but we'll definitely have some time at the end where we will do a Q&A. So go ahead and enter your questions. Get used to entering in the box, enter them as you think of them. And if you have any issues, you can also chat questions to us. And myself and my colleague Daniel will be looking at the questions and checking those things out while the speakers are speaking. So with that, now I'd like to introduce our speakers, and I'm going to refer to my crib notes on this. Steve Spear is hosting today's event. He is a 5-time Shingo Prize, Crosby Medal, and McKinsey Award winner, also author of Decoding the DNA of the Toyota Production System and the High Velocity Edge, and he's a senior lecturer at MIT. Joining Steve, we have an amazing group of education and community leaders who are here to share their story of the last year and a half with you all. First, we have Pat Greco. She's a nationally recognized for her leadership in continuous improvement in education, and she's a senior director of thought leadership at Studer Education. Next, we have Corey Gala. He's known for his work on leadership and policy analysis, and he is the superintendent of schools in Menominee Falls. I knew I was going to butcher that. Sorry. And then last but not least is Dale Shaver. He is the director of the Waukesha County Department of Parks and Land Use. He's also a cabinet advisor to the county executives, and that really put him at the center of pandemic response in the county. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Steve, and I'll be back at the end to host Q&A.
Yeah, hey Alice, thanks for the introduction, getting this all set up, and I just want to thank you. A couple of thanks here to my guests, Corey, Pat, and Dale, who have just really incredible things to say in terms of what they did with dealing with the particular crisis management that they had to attend to, starting over a year ago. And what I hope is that you're inspired by what they did as public servants, and I think a big set of kudos and thanks go out for that, but also to understand that what they did, when we look at the general principles, apply more broadly to any of us in situations where we have to manage through really abrupt change in unfamiliar circumstances. Now, just in terms of background on this, I think those people who are coming to this webinar know well enough that for a lot of years I've been concerned with kind of a key issue, which is how do we go about managing these very wide, sprawling, complex collaborative enterprises to generate really, really great amounts of social value, right? And I started my work looking at automotives, but it was the same issue, which was how do you organize the design of cars, the production of cars, logistics, service, maintenance, et cetera, so that society has way more value for the effort exerted than it would otherwise. And the same has kicked over into healthcare and so on and so forth. So if we have to pick a sector where it's without argument the amount of that our concerns are really about generating social value, education, right? We have tens of millions of children in the K-12 system every single day, depending on educators, those in the classroom and those administrating, depending on educators to prepare them to be successful, valued adults later on in society, and along with having good experiences being educated and socialized and developing and all of that. This is profoundly important. And before I get into some of the things that really motivated having this webinar today, I just want to acknowledge make two acknowledgments. One, this is a little bit of bragging, but I promise to do a little bit of public appreciation. My kids' school this year, and I'm wearing my Maimonides school here in Brookline, Massachusetts. If you're wondering why I'm wearing a sweater on a 95-degree day, it was so I could pull off this nice little theater. Our kids' school was open since September, and they remained open except for one little worry about a COVID cluster. They remained open from September all the way through June. And I just want to shout out the guy who runs the school, Scott Mattoon, and his staff, who did just a phenomenal job. And I just want to make one more acknowledgement and a little bit less. I have a colleague who I have great respect for, a guy named Des Walker, serves the nation in the United States Navy. His dad passed away just recently. And so just a tribute to Mr. Clyde Walker, who built a career as a math educator, a math instructor in Mississippi schools, a variety of different counties for his entire life. And I just think it's worthy as we talk through this issue of crisis recovery and education, just to give a moment of acknowledgement to Mr. Walker and really the highly valuable life that he led, and undoubtedly the lasting impact he had on so many people who he touched on every day. So anyway, thank you, Mr. Walker. Back to this issue of tens of millions of students. So nothing in the next bullet point is really shocking, is that you give students less and worse access to educational resources, and the outcomes are worse. They learn more, their mental health suffers, they have behavioral effects, they make fewer friends, et cetera, et cetera. And we hear about this all the time. The kids who can't get to school for whatever personal or family circumstances, the kids who suffer the summer slump, that they come back in September not nearly where they left off in June. And so that's just an overall concern. Now, here are some numbers. Think about this. January 2021, we're already 9 months into COVID, all right? 9 months into COVID. And, a shocking number of students aren't going to school every day. Now let's go to the second bullet point, right? Which is, so what does that mean? A shocking number of students, and we're talking tens of millions of young people. They're learning worse, they're socializing worse, their mental health problems are worse. And look, I speak with this great passion, if you're wondering why. I grew up in New York City, huge public school system. And, for a lot of kids, ideally, school is about reading, writing, arithmetic, and making friends and cutting class and that kind of thing. But for a lot of kids, school is their foundation. It's where they get their meals every day. School is their foundation where they get their health care and their health checks every day. School is the foundation where someone goes up who's got concern and says, hey, how you doing? How you doing? And school plays such a profound role in the lives of tens of millions of students every day. So when you get through August, September, October, November, December, and you have 60–70% of students who haven't been to school since the previous March, it's a tragic thing. And just to put this in some context, when we get to April, all right, now we're already a year into COVID, and basically you start looking at these numbers. Guess what? 75% of white kids, they can show up at school to do what? Clear out their desks. It's April already, for God's sakes. And it gets worse and worse and worse. So anyway, today the goal is to compare the kind of leadership that has most kids still not in school a good 6, 7, 8 months into COVID, what we're going to call approval leadership. And we're going to compare that with improvement leadership. And I have just 3 great examples in the guests we have today. But I just want to give you a flavor, and y'all can figure out for yourselves who said these things. But this is what approval leadership looks like. Basically, and this is recent quotes, that the reason we couldn't get kids back into school by January 2021, again, that's 6 months, 8 months already into COVID, and the reason so many still couldn't get back is Donald Trump's fault. After all, if that guy hadn't been there tweeting and getting people confused and this thing and that thing, we would have had the schools open. But it's Donald Trump's fault that we couldn't open. And then but how can we open? Well, thank goodness for the vaccine. Thank goodness for the vaccine, because the vaccine returns everything to normal and we can go back to school. Now, let's just think about that for a moment. When this COVID thing started, again, we should just count our blessings on this, thanks to the folks at Moderna and Pfizer and this place and that place, AstraZeneca, that we got vaccines within a year. A year ago, no one was predicting vaccinations by 2021. They were saying, if you're lucky, 2022, if you're lucky. All right. So this idea of depending on the vaccine to open schools, what this person was really saying is we would have stayed closed for 2 years with all the consequential deprivation to children. But anyway, you keep going. You look at this. What does it mean that we open because of the vaccine? What it really means is that type of leadership was incapable of dealing with crisis, And if the vaccine had taken 5 years, I guess the kids would have sat home not learning reading, writing, arithmetic, or how to make friends for 5 years because we're waiting on a vaccine. Anyway, what I'm trying to do is say, this approval leadership, it really boils down when you get past all these fancy words. It's just saying the dog ate my homework. That's why I'm not ready to go. So anyway, what I want to do is kick this over to the terrific guests we have, and what they're going to do is really unpack both in terms of concepts, and then with really some phenomenal examples, what we mean by an improvement culture versus an approval culture, improvement leadership versus approval leadership. So with that, let me just allow an opportunity for self-introduction. So Dale, Corey, Pat, please introduce yourselves to the folks who joined in, and go from there.
Well, thank you. My name is Dale Shaver. I serve as the Director of Parks and Land Use for Waukesha County. So really in that capacity, most of my work daily is working on community and economic development. But for the past over a year, I was redeployed as the lead, if you will, of the Waukesha County's COVID response. So I'll share a lot of my observations on improvements from that view.
And I think Corey?
Yeah, my name's Corey Gall. I'm the Superintendent of Schools in Menomonee Falls School District. And I think what's important to know about our district and for this conversation is we've been on a journey for about 10 years, starting under the leadership of Dr. Greco, who's here with us now, to work to embed the principles of improvement of quality into school systems. We're really trying to do exactly what Steve outlined at the beginning. And I just want to say I'm really honored to be part of the panel because in that journey, we've drinking from a fire hose. We've read some of your work, Steve, and try to crosswalk that. And the high velocity edge in particular was critical to me to just bring more pace to our work without compromising quality of our improvements. So excited to be here and share our story. And I'll turn it over to Pat, who was really my mentor in this type of work.
And it's a pleasure to join Steve. I've been a fan of Steve's work for quite some time, and like Dale and Corey, all three of us have a background in lean organizational excellence. Both Waukesha County and the School District in Menomonee Falls have worked with Huron student education in part of their improvement journey. And now after retirement, I served for 38 years in public education, half of that as a school superintendent in the Metro Milwaukee area. And now I'm working coast to coast with organizations on their improvement journeys. And Steve, like you shared, some organizations got stuck because they were waiting for answers from other places. Some leaders were able to dig in and really learn as they were going into that improvement effort, keep those decisions close to the work. And really, Dale and Corey, it's an honor. I've had the opportunity to work with them over the last year in telling their story and what they were learning from that process, as well as watching leadership teams get stuck. So I'll be able to share from that perspective.
Yeah, Pat, that's fantastic. And we're going to kick it back. And I just wanted, just for the people listening for the first time, in terms of thinking about this, sort of geometrically, you've got the county, and Dale's, speaking on behalf of the county, kind of at the center. And you can imagine in the approval culture, people are just sitting around twiddling their thumbs, saying, "Hey, Dale, what do we do?" And then, and that could be, if you want to think about this, Corey is superintendent for his district, saying, "Hey, Dale, I'd love to go back to school, but tell me what to do." And then you can imagine in Corey's district, principals and whatnot looking to Corey and saying, "Oh, well, I'd love to go back to school, but I'm waiting for you as the head of this node." And they can even imagine in the individual schools, teachers looking at the principal and saying, "Well, I'd be delighted to teach, but I'm waiting for answers." And I think for those of you, and it's got to be 2/3 of you, right? 3/4 of you. For those of you who were in districts where your kids didn't go back to school, I guarantee that was what was going on. Someone was looking at Dale, someone was looking at Corey, waiting for the answers. And what I want to do is now kick it over to Dale, and then Dale to Corey to explain how in their county and their district, They didn't have people waiting around. Rather, what they did is they figured out how to tap into the distributed and the collective genius of their colleagues to get to the point where they had a much better situation for their kids than elsewhere. Anyway, Dale, over to you, and just just tell me when to click.
Thank you. So for our attendees, as you can see, we'll be using child learning and face-to-face learning as the case study here, but this is really more about organizational culture. And so some of our objectives today are really, how do you use extreme delegation, or delegating, said another way, to those staff that are directly touched by the issue? And whether it's school or COVID, you name it, all of these learning objectives here play out. Using data, decomposing large problems into smaller ones, seeking feedback, and building communication or continuous improvement cycles. All of those base organizational cultural attributes played out here. And so our goal today is to use this case study, but to keep going back to those larger organizational value things. So Steve, we'll just dive a little bit deeper here into some of these principles. So when we take a look at the COVID-19 response, in particular to the impact of schools, we went back to that continuous improvement mindset that we have and Corey has in his school district. And that is, we weren't going to wait around to be told what to do. We took some time and we wanted to analyze, what data do we have? What are we really dealing with? And then how do we structure our response around, do we have the right subject matter experts, and our timeline and our structure? So our first step was really understanding the problem, and then that way setting ourselves up for success. So I have some data just to give from a countywide perspective. In June of 2020, as most of the states like Wisconsin went into a safer at home, or a shutdown order, if you will, we were experiencing about 10 to 20 positive COVID cases a day. That meant that nearly 75,000 school children in Waukesha County were now forced to learn virtually. By contrast, our unemployment rate in Waukesha County is basically full employment. So anybody at 92% labor participation rates, 2.3% unemployment, anybody that wanted a job was working. So quite frankly, our issue was struggling to find labor force to keep pace with our economy. Suddenly, with children now working studying at home, parents weren't able to be available to work. Our unemployment rate now skyrocketed to 11.7%. So by contrast, 10 to 20 positive COVID cases a day. Now we had 18,000 individuals that were now unemployed. And so we'll break this down, but you can quickly see we viewed this as not just being a pandemic. This was an economic crisis that happened to have a pandemic embedded in it. And quite frankly, that just set our mindset differently around this problem and how to decompose it to move forward. So how did we do that? Next slide, Steve.
Yeah.
So we knew we had past experience in Wisconsin. We're blessed with snow days from time to time, where schools can't be in session. And we do know, based on experience in continuous improvement discussions we have with hospitals, that on those days, it unfairly hits nurses, where those moms end up staying home because their children are not able to go to the school. And so what this pandemic had the potential to do is take a snow day on steroids and extend this potentially for months or a year or more. So we knew immediately that businesses were going to struggle with staff availability. Through Corey's work and the work of school districts, that we were polling our parents, and for the same reason, 80 to 90% of the parents wanted students to be safely in school learning. And as I mentioned, that we had an economic development crisis first and a pandemic second. So how did we solve this problem? How do we build structure around that? So Steve, if you can advance the slide. We needed to avoid silos. This wasn't a red or blue issue. This wasn't a political issue. This was a continuous improvement mindset. We weren't going to sit around waiting for the state or the federal government to say, this is the roadmap to success. And we also didn't feel that this was an either or, meaning that you could not have children safely in school. We felt that we could have both, that we could build a process of improvement and cycles of improvement around the concept where we want our cake and eat it too. We will have children and teachers in school safely learning. So that set that objective. And leveraging some strengths, Steve, on the next slide, that allowed us then to build our system and leveraging some of our expertise. Hospitals were already ahead of us by about 2 months. They were forced immediately in the pandemic to start building safety protocols inside of hospitals. So hospitals were safe for patients and employees. So we were going to bring them to the table. K-12 educators. In Waukesha County, we have 16 public school districts and 54 private schools and 3 higher eds. We knew that that was going to be an impossible task if we were going to work with each one of them individually. So we built a coalition to communicate. And then finally, we worked at a large business nonprofit, a chamber, if you will, to be the information conduit so that businesses knew that schools were working to get their children back to school so their employees would be available. And then finally, my final point would be, whatever project or problem you're working with, next slide, Steve, that we need actionable data. And what I watched around the nation, quite frankly, is individuals or organizations were using national or even statewide data or countywide data. That wasn't going to work here. If we had a shared objective to safely have children and teachers in school learning face to face, we needed data at that level so that those, if we're extremely delegating to teachers, if you will, they needed the data not only at the school district level, but really at the school level. So what we provided to the public was data available by school district and even at an individual school or classroom cohort level. And I know Corey will break this down even further as we move forward. But again, whether it's COVID and school learning, these are all just basic principles for managing a problem or leading up to a problem solution.
Dale, thank you. Let me, I think Corey.
Yeah, I'll pick it up, and thanks, Dale, and thanks for the partnership. And again, just humbled to represent the work of our district, because one of the first categories or buckets that Steve references is extreme delegation, and this truly was a full team effort from our school board through our leadership team, through our teachers and our community. And if you could just go to the next slide. A critical part of our story was going all the way back. We first started to think about the pandemic and how it might impact our ability to our schools in early March. That's when we had our first kind of pandemic plan, a true plan that we were developing that we may have to action. It was mid-March. Of course, everyone knows that's when everything got shut down. And on our first day of working in that after that shutdown, it was a Saturday morning, our school board and our leadership came together and we established these guiding principles that you see in front of you. And the intention of those was really we knew we were going to be making a lot of decisions, and we didn't know how long, and we certainly didn't imagine it was going to be as long as it was. But this is really where the priorities, the purpose that we had of, we were understanding in our vernacular, having been on a journey of improvement for 10 years, that we had to clearly define our purpose. And in this case, we had a problem that was complex and we really didn't know the solution for it. So whenever you start with a big problem, you've got to have some clarity around that problem. And what you see in these principles was that they balance multiple obligations. So obviously student health and employee health was important, but we also have an obligation to student learning, the health of our students, the mental health of our students, and we had other obligations that you can see in there. These principles stayed untouched all the way. They stay with us today as we make these decisions upcoming for the fall, and they were critical for us as we determined, how are we going to monitor success? We obviously had to watch the COVID data closely, but we also needed to understand were are our students hitting their academic targets? Are our students engaged? Are our families feeling supported? All of those pieces were there. If they're a priority for us, we knew we had to action around them and have data to watch that. They helped us as conditions changed. We didn't stay in the same model, so we stayed fluid because we knew as conditions around COVID improved, or as we learned what our mitigation procedures were capable of, we knew, okay, now we can tip the balance more in favor of student learning and student presence and that student experience. So the principles and that having that great sense of purpose were incredibly important to us. If you could turn to the next slide, Steve. The next is really a timeline of where we've been from March when we closed through summer, where we were in that virtual, or in spring when we were all in that virtual environment. But what I wanted to really talk about with this timeline was it represents our learning over time. So we went about March 15th, we closed. Within 2 weeks, we had a pulse check survey going out to families and students to understand what's their experience. Are they feeling like they're able to manage their workload? Are they staying connected with school? We were watching attendance from the very start to understand how engagement looked, and we were constantly learning. So as summer came and we recognized that we were going to have to make plans for the fall, we already had a lot of information at our disposal to make those plans for the summer. We also have the benefit of having a community education and recreation program as part of, we oversee our community ed and rec. We had summer programs in place with mitigation efforts involved, and those really served as small test sites for us to understand what are we capable of doing safely as the pandemic grew. So we were just constantly learning. And as you can see at the midpoint in this slide, we started in a hybrid model where essentially half of our students on a rotating basis were in the classroom. The other half, we had a model where they could tune in live and they could interact with their classmates and their teacher. So we had that model in place, but we recognized very early we had academic information and observations from teachers within the first 2 weeks of school that our 4K to second graders were really struggling in that model when they were virtual. So we made a decision, despite the rising COVID numbers, in October, that we would bring all of those students back full-time, face-to-face, and just monitor the COVID impact very closely, because we were tipping the balance too much in favor of concerns around health and really losing the battle on their academic progress. And long term, we know if students can't read at third grade, they're going to fall behind. So just evidence of just this continually learning through the COVID data, through our pulse checks with families and students, and the actual academic data that we had. If you could go to the next slide, that would be helpful. A lesson we've always known but is magnified, and we will carry this forever, was the importance of two-way communication. Extreme delegation and leading through crisis requires extreme clarity of purpose, transparency, and that two-way communication, so that lessons learned in the classrooms, in the schools, is cascading out across our district so we can all improve the models that we were in. To expect results from delegated authority and support from those navigating the change, i.e. our parents and our kids, everyone needs all the information that we have available to them. And I would also say, and it's represented here, the cadence of that, of when things are more predictable, we believe it's incumbent on leaders. When things are less predictable, we need to be more predictable as leaders. So it was important. Families knew on Friday they're going to see our, any changes, what our intentions are, forecasting decisions, so that cascading communication, two-way communication was extremely important. And our parents supported us, as evidenced through those consistent surveys, because they understood our intentions, they understood the current conditions, they understood our challenges. And we had this spring the highest parent engagement survey results we've had since we started tracking in 2013. If you can go to the next slide, I'll just talk briefly about data. Was critical. Here's an example of what our reports look like to our community and across our district, of looking specifically at how many students in this moment have an actual case of COVID, how many students are quarantined, breaking it down, as Dale said, by school. So we didn't want to make decisions that were district-wide. We wanted to go by level, by school, by classroom, to make the decisions at the smallest unit possible. And again, just sharing that information, being transparent, I think it helped our families to understand when the politics really started to swirl around this, that we did have impact. We had 200 students get COVID. We had to quarantine over 1,000 students. We had, I think, about 70 of our employees got COVID, and the impact around isolations and quarantines of employees made it difficult to staff at times. Our families were patient with us as they understood those challenges with some clarity. The next slide, again, just referencing data, we were tracking very early the pulse check to understand how our students were performing in their respective classrooms. We made the decision going into this year that we weren't going to let COVID compromise our goals. So we set goals that were equivalent to what we would for a typical year. And we said, let's do everything we can in our power to make sure those students did that. And when we made that adjustment in October for the earliest learners, we were hitting those academic marks, which allowed us to be a bit patient in terms of the moves we made academically. We did recognize, as Dale said, the hardship on families. So we were consistently working to bring more elementary students back and being a bit more patient with those secondary. Next slide, please. And the last couple of points I want to make is our discussion was never about opening or not opening. We remained focused on those principles, on those conflicting priorities. We intended to protect student health, the student experience of school, and to maximize the academic outcomes through the pandemic. And we realized, as complex as that was, you could open poorly in the same way that you could stay closed and get poor results. So we created a model where we felt we could move seamlessly between multiple models depending on the conditions in our classrooms and at school. And even when we were by mid-year full face-to-face for all students, we still needed those skills in the hybrid model and the virtual model, because when students were quarantined or when we had long-term absences, we needed to continue to meet those needs. So if they're home for 2 weeks, they're zooming into their classroom as if they were there, and that really helped us. So that we never wanted to be married to a single solution, whether it was to be open or to be closed. And my last slide is the next one, and I just want to stress the importance of, we talk in the quality world about voice of customer. Our students were our customers. And even though the high school students don't need the care at home necessarily in terms of a parent there, we knew the students were learning. We recognized from a survey the only declining or regressing statistic we had was this question of students saying, I'm feeling less connected with my friends. And despite some pretty active COVID numbers at mid-year, we said that's worth the risk. Let's go ahead and bring all students back, because our students were feeling isolated, they were feeling lonely, they were feeling disconnected, and we know we're an important social component of their lives. So that's how we thought about all of this. And again, I just shout out to all of the people across the district, because this was not a team of 5 leaders. We had teams across the district just constantly problem solving, constantly communicating, and really did some remarkable work this year.
And Steve, before we kick in, there's just a couple of things that I'd like to add based on knowing the stories of Dale and Corey and the work that they were doing as they were entering into this work. Corey is principals that were actually accelerating the rate of meeting time with teachers during the course of the summer via Zoom, so that they were getting direct feedback. They were modeling what a hybrid classroom would look like and feel like, so that they could have hundreds of teachers zoom into that demo and give feedback live before they started in September and October in that hybrid mode. Dale was working with all of the nurses from every school district across that county, so that they were getting that direct frontline feedback. And then the very next day, working with the area superintendent so that that scaffold communication was happening to the people closest to the work and the people leading the systems. So part of the beauty of this was really the agility. Dale, I don't even know if you remember saying this, but at one point in time you shared with me, you had up to 25% of your workforce that were shifting roles because they were needed someplace else. That level of agility, no one was saying it's not my job. No one was saying I'm not here for that. You know, no one was entering into it with that level of confusion because they built that culture and commitment around service, improvement. Scaffold did that deeply. Corey had classroom aids, problem solving, how to navigate, how to enter into buildings when they were predicting snow in January, and they were literally out in the playground predicting the flow to keep the social distancing, kids safe, and be able to keep kids coming in, even though there was snow predicted and it would change those normal routines. So all hands on deck really meant all hands on deck.
Pat, that is fantastic. Hey, Alice, I know you've been, capturing some comments and questions from folks listening, and so while you're getting those organized, I just want to share a couple of real quick impressions of my own. One, I just step back from the slide here. Well, it just dawned on me a sort of a qualitative quick check of whether a group is cultivating an improvement culture. How many Post-it notes are on the wall? And I have to, I know it sounds silly, but here's what I have to believe. In the case of the approval culture, the approval leadership, most walls were blank. That people were just waiting for the memo. They were waiting for the email telling them what to do. And I have to believe you guys kept 3M just in heavy business, because at the county level, at the district level, at the school level, at the classroom level, you had people, Post-it note, capturing observations, generating data, et cetera, et cetera. So I hope that doesn't get misinterpreted for those inside the approval culture organizations. They say, that's the solution. We have to go out and buy Post-it notes. But certainly a good leading indicator. And I just want to offer one other observation. Then Alice, over to you. Is it was this slide. So when we started, actually, let me come back to this slide in a moment. Let me kick to this slide. We said that this improvement culture, this improvement leadership has 5 attributes. And certainly, kicking out to the edge from the center, the opportunity to gather data, assess data, make sense of data, try things, because the people at the edge have the data they're getting, it's quicker, it's more idiosyncratic, it's more fine-grained, et cetera, et cetera. But then to this point, and make sure you pull the pieces, pull things together. But it's this last bubble that planning, preparation, and performance, they're happening all the time as opposed to happening sequentially. You can imagine in an improvement, in the approval culture, in the approval leadership, they say, oh, everyone stand back, we're planning now. Stand back, everybody, we're preparing now, and now everybody, it's time to perform. And I was just thinking about this slide right here, which is, and Corey was talking to this, that you guys closed on the 13th. By the 14th, you're open. I mean, you're working, trying to figure out what to do. By the 17th, you're back in session. I mean, that's flipping incredible, right? That, and again, it's not perfect because it's kids trying to figure out how to get Wi-Fi and how to get this and share the iPad, and kids are fighting over that. But 4 days later, you're back up and running. And just as an aside, we're going to send this to anyone who registered. I wrote a case about crisis recovery at Toyota, where they lost a factory to a cataclysmic fire, and people are predicting, I think, gleefully, and this just proves the vulnerability of their system. They'll be shut down for months. And in fact, they were open 3 days later, and within a week, they were operating at full capacity. So anyway, this slide was really telling. But back to the point of planning, preparation, and performance are all going on all the time. it's just striking when you think about this. So you guys shut down on the 13th. You get back to work on the 14th, 15th, 16th. On the 17th, you open school again. And I have to believe, and Corey, I know you were joking because you guys do get a lot of snow. It's old hat for us, snow days. But snow days typically are like a day or two, not a semester. So I have to figure that there's a huge amount of problem solving going on just how to maintain this, snow months worth of education. But while you're doing that, you're already planning to open and doing all the hard conceptual, experimental cycling, prototyping work to open on September 1st. And so I just thought that was a phenomenal example of how these things aren't supposed to happen. The thinking and the doing, they don't happen in isolation or from each other or sequentially. It's happening on all the time. So there can be this conversation back and forth. Anyway. Let me tamper down my enthusiasm for a moment. Alice, over to you. What do people have to ask? What do people have to say so far?
Okay, so I'm going to read off some of the questions. We do have a number that have come in. So, and if you're watching this and you have questions, go ahead and enter them now. We have several questions that have come in related to the gathering of information. Even before Corey, you shared this slide about student polling data. That was one of the questions that came in early. Was there systematic polling of students about their experience? And another person is asking a similar question, but about teachers. Did you, how were the teachers doing over time? How were they doing? And were you kind of asking them, and how were you getting feedback from them?
Yeah. Thanks for the questions. A very similar process with teachers and all of our employees as well as getting that feedback. We did the formal pulse surveys with them from the very beginning. More importantly, I think more significant for them was we were doing regular voluntary Zoom meetings where we would present all of the information we had, present all of the information we didn't have, the things we didn't know, and just forecast some of those decisions. And then we had it set up where they could submit questions ahead of time, or we had somebody monitoring, just like Alice is now, monitoring questions in real time. They asked some really tough questions, but that transparency was so critical for them because that was a big ask in the fall when we asked them to come to work in a face-to-face environment, given the unknowns. I mean, in hindsight, we're always going to say it worked. We didn't know exactly what would happen when we did that in August, and they showed up, we believe, because they had that information. So that was critical. We did these pulse check surveys like this with students. The very earliest, I mentioned the one 2 weeks after we closed, was simply who's got Wi-Fi, figuring out who has Wi-Fi and who doesn't, and getting those hotspots out to those, who just understanding what those needs are, and then just problem solving, exactly as Steve alluded, of just problem by problem, kid by kid. When we had attendance issues, we were dealing with those by household. In fact, even when we were in hybrid, there were families, we said, this isn't working for your kid. And we said, they're coming back full-time, face-to-face, because we were losing contact with them.
So on a similar vein, like another person is asking about the communication methods, so the technicalities of it. I'll just read the message. One of your messages has been communication is key, especially with parent and families. Can you share challenges, opportunities with the technology you used to communicate with parents and families? Do you have lessons learned from that? Did you use text, email, robocalls, and what worked best?
Yeah, all of the above. I mean, we were sending that communication out from district level. We had sent it out Friday, and then on Sunday, it's typical that our principals send a sort of week at a glance out to families. So they were grabbing what applied to their level, sending those same messages out at the same time. We've got information from our past experience with families to know where they get their information from. So we knew that email still works best. That's largely how that went out through our PowerSchool system. We could use robocalls whenever we needed those also, but that email was really the typical way that we did things. And then of course our board meetings every 2 weeks, when we met as a board, we would do the COVID update and forecast all of those decision points, and the board at that point would weigh in and let us know where their support was and where they wanted us to focus in other directions.
And Alice, I think just even bringing this up a notch higher, certainly focusing on all of the technology and options for communicating. But if we think about it from an organizational effectiveness standpoint, what Corey did, along with the 15 other school districts, is they built a cadence for communication. So when Corey talked about that Friday newsletter, parents quickly began to trust that I would have key information or right information at the right time. And so it didn't matter what the technique was, it's the methodology of developing trust that you will get the information when you need it, and it'll be transparent. And so I just wanted to share that sometimes we get too deep into overthinking some of the technique as opposed to what's the goal here.
And similarly, I'll say because Dale's team was doing weekly meetings with all superintendents where the director of the county health department was sharing the current local information regarding COVID, as well as all of what have they learned about COVID and mitigation. They were sharing that with us every Tuesday or Wednesday. I think they were Wednesdays. I was taking notes on those, immediately sending those out to our leadership team and our school nurses. And boy, they came to rely on those. Like if I didn't send my updates out, they were reaching out to us right away that they wanted those. So, and again, very simple thing that I just realized as I'm listening one day, boy, there's a lot of people that could benefit from having this information, and that put them in a much better spot to answer all those questions they're getting from all of their people all day, every day.
I think the other thing, Steve, that I just want to point out from a perspective of Corey was going into the board with the updates based on the principles, but he wasn't waiting for necessarily board approval. What I was seeing happening across the country was people going 2 weeks at a time between board decision making being really elongated and slow. This team really positioned the board to be action oriented and part of that decision making because they had those regular updates, but not necessarily waiting for that level of approval. So it was much more agile. The other piece that, and it goes back to what Dale was saying with the cadence, even if there was no new news, the cadence was kept, which kept that calm around, we have the information, we're not missing any information. That fear level, when you take a look at what was happening across the country, because people were waiting to hear, they weren't building that level of cadence and that expectation, and really no news was considered good news, but no news was actually building level of anxiety because people felt disconnected from that decision making.
Yeah, Pat, just pulling a parenthetical on that one. This conversation comes up, I think, in all the work I do, whether it's inside factories, inside hospitals, or with students I have who are doing field-based theses. If you have to choose between delivering a fixed quantity or at a fixed time, go with the fixed time.
Yep.
Because it becomes a good forcing function to maintain the connectivity. And we have this with students. So what milestones do you want to hear from me? And the answer is Friday. That's the milestone. And if you have a lot to tell me on the Friday, then we have a lot to talk about. If you have nothing to say on a Friday, that's actually a very important signal too. But at least it maintains our shared situational awareness, where if we waited for the milestones, so much could happen without any conversation. So I think, Pat, you're taking a very important particular point about just maintaining the tempo. And I just want to echo that is a hugely important thing across a lot of situations. So
the other thing, Steve, that Corey had mentioned, but I just want to blow out a little bit, is typically when you think about schools, Principals and teachers will send the updates at the end of the week. They really reversed that cycle where they were previewing what was coming ahead so that parents felt equipped if students were in hybrid or on the days that they were home to actually be able to be that co-facilitator with the teacher, that level of parent communication. And it goes back, Corey didn't mention this, but they earned top workplace during COVID. They earned the highest parent feedback during COVID. They had students indicating, I feel supported and learning during COVID. So having that ability to actually action differently was really all part of that process of really their commitment, that long-term commitment to leaders understanding improvement, both at the county level and at the school district level. Teachers understanding improvement for a decade. So they were able to action differently and really be part of that team.
Right. Pat, I'm just going to pull up a slide we hadn't showed to this point about maintaining the tempo, and it's this the second rectangle here is this notion that improvement or innovation or anything else is cyclic, that we have to keep tapping it along. And we have to tell you on Monday, here's what we expect to happen this week. Friday, here, let's do a debrief in terms of what actually happened. So over the weekend, when we broadcast out to Monday, you have trust that what we're broadcasting out Monday benefited from what we learned from the previous Monday to Friday. So it's fantastic. Hey, Alice, I'm just checking the time, and we're nearing the top of the hour. Do we have another question queued up here?
We do have a bunch, several questions, and I'm going to try to group them together a little bit. We have a number of people who are here from other parts of the country where COVID cases were much higher. We have some district superintendents here from, other states where policies and protocols were different. So I think the question really is given the importance of safety and engagement, I'm reading one of the questions that kind of gets at this. As guiding principals, their school district chose to stay virtual longer. Staff expressed concern about safety. Case rates were higher. Rules and state rules were much more restrictive. So I'm wondering if maybe Pat can comment on that sort of view across the country. And we even have people internationally on the call here who are, somebody from the Netherlands, some people from elsewhere in the world who also dealt with school reopening issues. So the context, I think, across the country would be super helpful, and maybe that big picture would be helpful.
Yeah, and I think that's important. And I think it also is part of the point that Steve was raising is when we identify policy for big regions, as opposed to keeping the policy and the decision-making really tight to the work, I think that ultimately, when we think about it, children won't be vaccinated by September. The case rates will have to drive the decisions. The case rates, quite frankly, should drive mask or no mask. We've fallen into a pattern of policy and politics, getting way away from those people close to the work. And it's also driving part of staff fear, because staff members are even having the conversation of, should we be in school when, our neighbors across the state aren't in school? That really shouldn't be the health, the safety. Hospitals are back in. We should be learning as a community. We should be driving the information as a community and really actioning together across agencies seamlessly. In any crisis, this is just one we were learning from.
And Alice,
I just want to add to that, if I could, and just say, we were never cavalier. We were always cautious, but we were constantly asking the question, how is COVID affecting our schools now? And really asking that critical piece. And we are also learning that our mitigation strategies from the summer through that very early fall were holding up. And we were seeing no evidence of spread, and Dale can attest that across the county, schools were not. In fact, those schools that started full face-to-face, we're seeing the same thing, that with these other mitigation efforts in place, this could be done. And we did have exceptionally high levels of COVID in the mid-fall, but we actually had doctors from Children's Hospital say schools might be a safer place for them to be than the alternative.
And just to give some context to the listeners as to what that sounded like, I did quote 10 to 20 cases back in at the start of COVID, but all of the mitigation efforts, the work, the continuous improvement cycles that were built around this allowed us to endure up to 1,100 positive cases a day by the time we hit November. And so we were well into a full stride of an academic year, performing well. And the numbers just proved out that schools were a safe place to be. 1% of students then tested positive. We had virtually no transmission in schools between cohort groups because of the way that was set up. And so because we monitored the data and the mitigation efforts were there at a very low level, and they were tested and adjusted, sometimes even daily, we were able to ride through some very high numbers.
That's great. Hey, we're at the top of the hour, and I apologize for interrupting the conversation. So let me just do a couple of thanks here. One to you guys for doing this, but more importantly, for giving a good experience to those 75,000 kids in your county and all those people who had to have fairly normal lives because schools were open. And that's fantastic. I want to also thank the people who tuned in, maybe listening on the recording, because they have deep concern with what's so important. Alice said there were a number of people from different regions, different countries, different fields. Let's keep the conversation going. We'll reach out to you with some materials, a couple of articles, book excerpts, the slides, and the recording link for this thing. But what I want to say is, a thank you to everybody, and let's keep talking about this. One extemporaneous thought I just want to end on. So today's Wednesday. Sunday, we're going to have a national holiday, Independence Day. And it dawned on me while we're having this conversation, that day, we're going to celebrate values which were so important in guiding what you did. Because what are we going to reread and celebrate on the 4th of July is the statement that all are created equal, right? And if all are created equal, that means we have to take everyone's concerns into consideration simultaneously and think about our situations as being multidimensional and think about our solutions as being multidimensional, and that those solutions not only have to serve the needs of everyone, but in order to arrive at them, we have to listen to the voices of everyone. And I know you probably weren't thinking about the Declaration of Independence back in March when schools were closing down, but clearly you were living those values that we espouse, strive to achieve better and better every day. So again, Dale, Corey, Pat, thank you so much. Thank you so much. And you set such a fine example. And so thank you for that. Alice, back to you.
I think with that, we are at the top of the hour. We did get a number of questions in that we didn't have time to answer, but I just want to thank everyone for submitting their questions, and we will try to circle back to you, and I'll let the presenters know what your questions were. Thanks everyone for joining. Bye-bye.
Right. Be well, everybody. Stay safe.